Panzer Paladin is a kick-ass 2D action game, and a smart little piece of mecha media. A traditional, epic premise about a humanoid pilot named Flame and her giant robot buddy named Grit, who fend off titanic demons to save the planet, is told under the lens of a vibrant throwback to swordplay platformers. Chibi sprites, rad cover art, 80s to 90s anime portraits, and handheld colored interpretations of real-world locations, and tons of neat animated combat variables and hidden gameplay systems. Montreal developer Tribute Games found a remarkable fit for a mecha-themed indie game, an adorably compact retro throwback based on one of the most heavy and spectacular multimedia concepts. And it really works here. Similar to the finest retro games and modern throwback games that impress with the talent, personality, and nuances beyond their constrained look, Mecha Projects have always found its hobbyist and thematic successes by challenging enthusiasts to find fulfilling avenues beyond its proposed spectacle. So it makes sense to use tight action side-scrolling to convey mechas as a toy, as a way to showcase slick directing and animation skills, and as a thematic vehicle for deeper challenges and sentiments. It's not a parody or a trendy costume, but a welcome pixel art encapsulation of the ardent and indulgent love that I and many others have for mecha media. It's my personal favorite game of 2020, despite its deliberate appearance like a relic of the past and a reminder of the times when going on outdoor adventures and rental stores was rad. It nevertheless made my imagination go wild with mecha wonder. The most cardinal joy it offers is in framing a giant robot like a fun toy, dramatically shrinking this lumbering metal giant that cutscenes can't fathom into a chibi platformer bod that takes the helm of traditional 2D sword and shield combat. What makes Grit so compelling are these little tics and properties to his character that cutely condense his extraordinary mecha identity, trading off momentous, large-scale combat with sharp and stabby swordplay, where Grit is always ready to confront and poke at his foe. Subtle movement traits like a slight glide to his steps, and weighty jumping to give him that cautionary feeling of heavy mecha movement. The game encourages careful attention to how he carries weapons and protection, standing and ducking against high and low attacks, and thrusting his weapon upward and downward corresponding to the side he carries it in. He also has these kinetic traits to his attacks, like the up thrust granting him a double jump, and the down thrust letting him pogo stick enemies Scrooge McDuck style. His innate strength is characterized by how he can throw and sacrifice weapons to deal multipliers of damage, which also relate to the different attributes between swords, spears, and clubs that grant varying thrusting speeds, swinging ranges, and power stats. All weapons he carries have reflective properties against projectiles, and he even has a Symphony of the Night style backdash that can cancel out of attack animations. There aren't always easy hitboxes. Every animation from Grit and enemies is purposeful and rewards you for paying attention to their posture, connecting the right pieces. Enemies have tells that clue in on whether they're about to strike upward or downward, and being able to read their strikes and attack the split second after they land on your shield grants you a dizzying parry that stuns and potentially drops collectible weapons. And my favorite touch is how Grit always faces armed opponents even when he moves away from them. Some fighting game tech injected into this robo too. It's like taking Teenage Link from Zelda 2 and transposing his playground fighting, close quarters combat style into the shape of a calculated but equally energetic mecha action figure. And like any great toy or antique, Grit has even more valuable internal features and cool attachable accessories. Usually we see super robots fighting off oversized demon monsters, where the mecha is displayed in large-scale combat while its pilot is subordinate to the larger action. So it's a real treat in this game that you not only get to control a chibi-sized Grit that fights off equally many kaiju, but you also have the option to deploy Flame, who's this adorably tiny pilot. Oh, so bite-sized you could pinch her little existence. She has a simple whip attack at her arsenal and is playable by choice or by circumstance. When either, you press the eject button to disengage with your mecha, or when Grit's health runs out and Flame is forced to survive on her own. While she may appear exclusively useful for mandatory sections where she must crawl into smaller spaces and swing on designated poles, The game's stage and enemy design are well thought out in accounting for her bare platforming and attacking skills. Every platforming obstacle can be overcome with her simple jumps and swings. Every level can be beaten with just her. Every enemy and every boss, yes, even up to the final ones, have openings that Flame can exploit with enough patience. Granted, it's a daunting scenario to have to resort to fighting these wide demons and layouts without the versatility of Mecha Grit. Honestly, the game could have greatly benefited from expanding on Flame's unique moveset more to incentivize playing as her, but she's a great backup plan nonetheless. Checkpoints are few and far between, so it's soul-crushing to accidentally lose Grit and fail to make it out alive as Flame when a giant demon sprite brutally does her in. But conversely, it's hella satisfying to be able to survive large portions of a stage and essentially play tiny, cautious Castlevania against enemies and the world. Being handy in accessing hidden rooms where only she can collect extra lives, decorated in this game as hidden cultural treasures, and obtaining health capsules for Grid along the way so she can return to riding him at respawn points, feeling like a complete character yet again. It's such a fun, multi-purpose idea. It's a forgiving mechanic, a neat layer to Grid as an avatar, and an adorable, playable dramatization of classic kid pilot and embodied mecha relationships. Think the 70s Mazinger Z or Asuka from Eva, the naive and thrilling power trip that human pilots enact when riding their personalized mechas, and the quasi-guardian angel safeguarding that the mecha ends up extending to them. Grit is a formidable weapon, but also a protective shield for a tinier wannabe hero. Both their health meters matter, but Flames is the be-all end-all. And even if the bigger, durable titanium shell dies off, it's assuring to know that it's not entirely over. Despite the brutal difficulty, there's still a smaller glimmer of hope that can fight for their future. The pilot itself. In addition to this pilot compartment, Grit gains even more novel personalization through the wide variety of weapons he can collect and carry. The game boasts over 100 different melee weapons to collect, including a mode where you can design your own weapons and discover custom-made weapons from people online. A back-of-the-box worthy range of weapons that can now go to an almost limitless variety. It's splendid that you can superimpose Grit's monumental image to both genuine and silly power fantasies through these weapons, and even Flame's small inclusion. The control scheme and dual nature of the avatar makes combat delightfully faceted and closely knit, expressing this mecha story less as a cinematic, spiritual miracle super robot, but more like the most hands-on little robot to tinker around with. Generally, it made me feel like an eager kid playing with his finished mecha kit. Everything about its posable plastic molded shapes and quirky functions being a work of your own little hands and opening tons of possibilities in your mind as to what it can achieve in the big world it inhabits. And seeing Grit staged in these inventive depictions of exotic real-world countries also gives that wonderful playset feeling to me. Countries are depicted in vivid, dynamic shots that blend inner and outer environments so intricately, using traditional parallax side-scrolling techniques to express a quasi-third dimension, and making a run through the stage often feel like a trek towards deeper spaces. The lush jungles of Mexico that lure you into a decrepit Mayan temple, traversing in and out of oversized train cars in Switzerland as mountains in the distance and gigantic overpasses fly by. The blinding lights of the USA night streets that take you into its underground transit system. My favorite is the always gorgeous white stone Greek island, set in a wistfully purple evening, and with the dusk of an even larger island utopia greeting you in the background. It's as if you could look beyond the 2D plane and reach into the backgrounds, and the worlds would still believably exist. Levels are finely constructed. What they lack in unique stage gimmicks or exciting events, they compensate with scenic and smart platforming levels. Open hallways and terraformed grounds for both combat and platforming to individually flourish and merge, all coated with a rich Game Boy Color-esque palette that not only harkens back to the bold style of the 90s, but also highlights the dystopian climate and time zone warping aesthetic of the journey. Mechas are the indicators of vast science fictions, the point where technology has advanced to such an alarming rate that the world has either reinvented or suffered in its wake. Flame and Grit arrive in familiar countries just in the nick of time to explore their cybernetic evolution. It sets an exciting stage to stop these apocalyptic baddies, whether it's daytime, sunset, or the dead of night. Paired with the soundtrack's digital fusion between brave chiptune and hard rock, and every level comes across as a triumphant snapshot of a brave new world. This game really excels at expressing modern flair from the old school, articulating the physical, animated, and formal wonders of mechas, despite their intentionally downscaled feel. Look at the way the camera tilts up to see Grit's entire height, while Flame's portrait sprite just shimmers. It's beautiful. This straightforward stage-by-stage side-scroller, where you episodically fight arbitrary mooks and masters, is enhanced under the premise of an absurd planet-wide conflict. An invasion of meteoric weapons that have transformed into demonic creatures, with their leaders resembling real-life mythological creatures called the Weapon Keepers. Animated, rotoscoped cutscenes, save for the beginning and endgame moments of the game, set the attractive anime stage, with figures like a scientist who hosts the upgrade section of your main menu and narratively informs about these events occurring because of their foretelling in the ancient Pazuzu parchments. A tough as nails, eye patch wearing director who questions if the rescue android Flame is truly built for the incoming war, and this green griffin looking leader of the Weapon Keepers named Ravenous, who yucks it up at your communication channel. I would have really liked more fluffy interactions and adorably melodramatic cutscenes with the crew and the villains, but what we get here is sweet enough. They help give an appropriately dramatic feel. Every sprite now has identifiable purpose, character, attitude, and context. Reminded me very much of the pizzazz of Tecmo's cutscenes for Ninja Gaiden on the NES at the time, using sparse but visually striking animatics to paint a larger, more dramatic picture for the simple frame of action gameplay. And more specifically, the highlight of the game's quality, the boss fights against the Weapon Keepers, these massive sprites with tons of unique animations and wide-scale attacks. Their unhinged characters as ancient weapons turn into berserk, mythical creatures are just marvelous to experience because of, once again, their adorable pixelated interpretations. The Baba Yaga riding her pots like a zooming spaceship, the wild cat-like Nian with screen-clearing attacks. Look at the way you enter the Scotland boss room. The dragon's shadow lurks in the rainy background, notices your arrival, and crashes into the scene. And when it unleashes its screen-clearing fire burst, you block that nonsense with Grit's shield. The logic of reflecting projectiles and even the parry mechanics of normal monsters even applies to big dumb bosses. It's amazing. There's a comical joy I find in making video game punching bags out of literal, actual, real folklore. But I think the real heart of the game, and what I feel makes it identifiably mecha, lies in the effects and the resulting narrative behind the game's hidden system, the Spirit Bird encounter. Grit can break whatever weapon he currently holds to unleash a unique spell. These are power-ups that you charge up to cast that grant healing, stat buffs, movement enhancements, and even special attacks. Thing is, you must purposefully sacrifice your weapon to perform these spells. Every weapon has a certain amount of durability, but having it break on you in regular combat will simply make it disappear without its spell triggering. So while collecting and designing weapons are fun in a hobbyist sense, they start becoming delicate and consequential when put into practice. Because this Spirit Burden score at the pause screen increases depending on how many weapons you end up collecting, and decreases the more you lose and break weapons. And having your total at a high number influences combat by having enemies deal more damage and making Weapon Keepers harder to kill. Hoarding is a viable strategy in gameplay, but the world around you becomes tougher to face as a result. To put this system into further perspective, a high Spirit Burden also gives you a higher probability of encountering this elusive horseman figure at the midpoint of any stage. that can potentially drop a custom-made weapon at low levels as an act of pity, or is guaranteed to fight you to obtain it at a higher level. He can be a nuisance to fight, since he basically exists to punish you for hoarding, but thematically, he's the game's clue that there's more going on with combat and collecting weapons than it appears. If you play your cards right and keep yourself at a consistently normal or low spirit burden, you probably won't ever have to fight him. It has that much of an effect. There's even an option to deposit spirit burden points at your home base in exchange for health upgrades. I would have liked to see a lot more upgrades than just a finite amount of health upgrades. They simply tell you to peace out once you get all of them, but it's great to see that pretty much every party involved is at the mercy of your behavior towards this number. You can take intentional measures to alleviate it, or simply ignore these options and proceed under their influence. The effects and consequences of the spirit burden system pose a lot of cautionary strategies and tendencies: hoarding weapons to save up decent spells, prematurely casting spells regardless of a weapon's durability, accidentally breaking weapons and losing precious spells in the heat of combat, always being faced with the option between sacrificing weapons into self-made checkpoints or skipping checkpoints altogether to save your weapons, or even if you should bother using weapons at all when Grit's fists alone are a weaker but viable option. Not to mention, Flame can be in the equation too. This can be a game about using what is useful, keeping your weapons in moderation to avoid over-reliance on them, encouraging you to make use of the spiritual potential and cleansing of weapons over their brutal physical usages that tempt you to keep them around. Or it can be a game where you dump that philosophy entirely and go full weapon hoarding overload, but having you reap whatever you sow. The weapons you earn from beating weapon keepers may feel like Mega Man Robot Master power-ups, but they're honestly slightly superior tools in a shed of tools that all have the same outcome: attacking, spellcasting, bound to be broken someday. There's never really one weapon to rule them all, as much as there are many to keep you lusting for more. I mean, is it really a blessing to obtain a super powerful weapon, but also one with a high spirit burden? Is it more of a blessing to get rid of it and get its spell? Does collecting all the weapons in the world to ensure your strength and survival truthfully pave the way for victory, or in the case of the game's little narrative, rightful justice? This is where my imagination truly soars. It's the kind of bombastic mecha euphemisms and themes put into gameplay that I'm glad this game attempted. This inventive difficulty modifying system gives combat even further choice-driven appeal and legit narrative tension at the right moments. The game never doubts or condemns the fact that morality is a double-edged sword in this mecha war, from gameplay to cutscenes and vice versa. Flame and Grit are confronted in parts of the story for their distinct identities as androids or combative machines, being no different than the power-hungry weapons they fight off and collect, and how they abuse the spirit burden system as a tribal, video gamey means to that earth-saving end, for better or for worse. Panzer Paladin doesn't have a narrative morality system that funnels you into one extreme or bludgeons your head over your choices mattering, but rather treats chaotic or lawful weapon usage as on-the-fly pressures towards a steadfast goal. You experience firsthand the consequences of hoarding or sacrificing weapons, and the game depends on you to respond to those trials accordingly. Both tendencies are your responsibility. And without going into explicit spoilers, even a final endgame moment that determines a good or bad ending is very Bastion-esque, being dependent on a personal gun-to-your-head judgment about the world of the game rather than accumulated gameplay. Something that really makes you hesitate and think about the narrative logic of Panzer Paladin's world, and the inherent tragedy behind spirit burdens and their influence on Flame and Grit. After your big sword, fun and games are all said and done, what do these heroes mean to the world now? You can choose for good if you want to taint their heroic image and worsen the war, or teach them to put the weapons down and aim for more fulfilling and humanistic endeavors. I can see some people finding it phony that their allegiance is based on a last-minute decision, but I think it makes a lot of sense here. 8 to 16-bit was the era of simple action games under an imaginative and revelatory backdrop, thinking about the immediate challenges and obstacle-based problems to get your avatar to the end, where the resolutions and diegetics of the game's world usually dawn on you. It's why the few cutscenes that are present fascinated me with their heavy dialogue and imagery, and it's why that particular moment at the end has so much urgency. The entire game is like enacting a hypothetical mecha war. There are desperate decisions you gotta make that either greatly benefit or severely handicap your survival. But anything goes at war, as long as you make it out alive. But it's what you decide to do after the madness that paves your future. And that, my friends, is how this game wonderfully carves a simple throwback side-scroller with the grandiosity of a classic mecha story. Panzer Paladin may not go super deep, but it's a lovely minuscule epitome of mechas in their passion, in their function, and in their revelatory grace, as extremely cool toys for kids, as directing vehicles for incredible tactics, and as signifiers for new frontiers and sinister or maturing themes. The inspiration of mecha successors to perpetuate these avenues are what weave the culture in the present, and what gave us this excellent little project. I do think that there are additions here that could be addressed in a follow-up, more attention to the variety of upgrades, movesets for both characters, and unique set pieces would have made it feel more complete. But what we have here is a strong foundation. I loved its lively anime look, its tailor-made and responsive action, its abundance of speedrunning and challenge modes, its expressions of so much despite looking like so little. It's an excellent super robot tribute, because despite shrinking and cutting the fat of mechas, it pushes pixelated limits to meaningfully express its most provoking and vigorous traits. A heartfelt reminder that mechas can still breed lovable spirits and creative hybrid projects of the present, no matter how much burden they amass.